All right. Now, I went ahead and finished the inlay border without filming it. I was just kind of on a roll. I didn't want to get the camera out. I'm going to real quick explain what I did and how I did it. So the groove, if you watch the previous videos that I routed, was 1/8 of an inch in width, and the depth was just shy of the thickness of the inlay, which I buy online. It's very inexpensive, and you can get it in many different woods, some natural, some dyed. This is natural cherry. Alright, so in this instance I just did a framing of 1/8 inch inlay, mitered at the corners, in an attempt to match the mitered veneer here. So all I do, obviously you have to get your veneer, or your inlay rather, ready, and it has to preferably be one long piece so that you wouldn't have a break, say here. Anytime you have a break in inlay, especially the lighter stuff, it shows up pretty noticeably. So I was lucky enough to have single strips the length that I needed. After that, it's just a matter of cutting the miters. I use a piece of MDF. You can use anything, any sort of block, and I use my combination square. So I'm just going to demonstrate this real quick. This is a cutoff, but I will bring this in. The first cut really doesn't matter. Just want to get it 45. Now I find that it's easier, rather than butting the piece all the way up against the fence down here, to keep it about a ½ inch up. That way you have room to put your chisel. And to make sure it's 45, I just make sure that the gap between the inlay and the bottom is relatively the same. Right there it looks like maybe about a ½ inch. So I would call that good. Hold it down, take a long chisel, flat side toward the blade of my combination square, and just kind of rock it into the cut. And you've got a nice miter. Then I'm going to place that in the groove, push it up right into the corner. Hopefully you can see that. And now obviously again, this piece is an offcut, so you're not going to see the actual method here. But if you could imagine that this was longer, it was too long, I would bring a pencil while holding it firmly, making sure that side is still where it needs to be. Come to this corner and take a mechanical pencil or something with a pretty fine tip, and just mark my edge. So we'll say it's stuck off about this far. I'm going to come right here, and the mark is actually going to be, for me I find it's easier to go on the inside, so I'll make a little mark right at the corner of this square. Go back to the chopping block. This time we're going to have to switch the combination square around. I'm going to feed my piece in again. And again, I like to keep it off of the fence here, just because it's easier. It gives my chisel more room to work. In this case, that looks like a pretty even space here. So this space is nice and even. That tells me that it's parallel, and that means that I'll have a nice 45-degree cut. So again, hold down, rock my chisel into the cut, and that's it. Now, if I would have had the presence of mind to film myself doing this, this piece would fit perfectly here, and then I would just kind of work around in a circle, making sure that when I do make a pencil mark for a cut line, that the last miter that I cut is pushed firmly into place, because the last thing you want to do is get to a position where you're gluing everything up and you've got a gap because the piece slid forward while you were making your pencil mark. But luckily I didn't have that problem. Everything looks good. If you do run into any little gaps like that, You can simply take a little bit of sandpaper or a scraper and scrape some of that dust and mix it with the glue that's going to squeeze out inevitably when you go to apply this, and then just kind of rub it into the gap, and it hopefully won't be too noticeable. So that's all for now. I will turn the camera back on after I have rough sanded this and scraped it. See you then. All right, so what I'm doing here, I am using my card scraper to scrape the inlay down probably about a thou or maybe 2/1000ths of an inch above the surface of the rest of the veneer. The rest I will get with my sander. I just don't want to have a situation where I sand through the veneer because I'm hanging out in one spot too much because the inlay is sticking up. So the scraper is really just to get everything down to almost level, and then you can come in and go through your series of sanding grits. Another important thing to note when you're scraping veneer, especially in this application where I've got veneer grain running in all sorts of different directions, you never want to scrape perpendicular to the grain. You don't want to scrape across it. It's okay to scrape at an angle. And so if I'm going to scrape into the corner of this chessboard, I'm actually going to scrape, if the corner of the chessboard were the point of an arrow, I would scrape in that direction. And that would guarantee that I'm not, no matter what I'm scraping across, I'm not going perpendicular to the grain. I'm kind of going at an angle, and that's much safer. This is also a great time to get rid of any residue left over from the veneer tape. Occasionally you'll have a little piece maybe that didn't come up with the steam trick that I showed you. Um, or some of the high glue residue. You can kind of see like a dark outline where the holes in the veneer tape are. This is a great time. Use the scraper to get that up. You do not want to rely on your sander to try to sand through that. Obviously, you're going to be reducing the level of that veneer more so than areas where there was not any residue. So go ahead and get that with the scraper now. All right. Once you have your veneer scraped and pretty much level, it's time to go on to sanding. Now, typically for a veneer project, I generally start with 120 grit on my random orbit sander, then go to 150 to 220 and to 320. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, well, 320 is too far for oil and polyurethane, and it's just kind of wasting your time. But I find that 320 grit, I just feel better about it. It gives me, it adds more clarity. I feel like more depth once you put the oil on. But it's, yeah, personal preference. If you want to stop at 220, you can stop at 220. Now, in this instance, I had already started sanding with 120 grit, and after I was finished, there were still some high spots, a couple in the corners, and I think on one side. At that point, don't be afraid to go back to your card scraper. Again, 120 grit is the coarsest grain you're going to be using here that I used. And so obviously, if it's not level now, going up through 220, 320 is not going to get it any more level. So go back to the card scraper if necessary to get everything knocked down to level, and then you can always go back and hit it again with some 120 grit. One of the issues I had with this project was that I used too much glue when I veneered the top of the chessboard down. My first time doing this, typically they tell you to put, I use a rubber ink roller and I apply the glue that way, and they tell you that you should be able to see a faint pencil line, or you should be able to see a pencil line faintly through the layer of glue that you spread. And I'm pretty sure I didn't do the pencil trick. I'm pretty sure I probably wouldn't have been able to see the pencil line through the amount of glue that I applied. I had just kind of plopped it on there and it was too much, and I just rolled with it. Well, the end result was when I pulled the chessboard out of the press, some of the squares of veneer had these kind of like little ripples in it, and it did not go away once it dried. So I was lucky I was able to scrape them down and not scrape through the veneer entirely. But just be mindful, don't put too much glue. It's kind of, you got to find the sweet spot. You can't put too little, you can't put too much. So be careful.
cool thing about sanding is it actually can shed some light on your problem areas. And so what I'm paying attention to as I'm sanding are any discolored areas. If I'm going over the veneer with my 120 grit, and I notice that after I've gone a pass over it, that there's still a darker area, that's a pretty good indication that that area is lower than the surrounding areas and has not been scuffed or sanded yet by the sandpaper. So once you're done with you're completely sanded with 120, you should hopefully see a uniform color, and it should be that kind of dull, freshly sanded. But if you see anywhere that's got a darker color to it, pay a little more attention to that, or at least run your fingers over it and make sure that it actually is level. What I'm using right here is 180 grit sandpaper, and I always like to hand sand at least with 1 grit at one point in my project, and generally, and you'll see this later, we'll definitely always hand sand with higher grits, be it 600, 800, 1,000 during the finishing process. But for this project, it was 120, 150, 180 by hand, 220, 320, and then the finish applied.
Alright guys, it's done sanding. Well, yeah, I'm done sanding. So what I did was I took the top, after I scraped it, I went to 80 grit, sanded with 80 grit, sanded with 120 grit, then 150 grit, then 220 grit, and then I finished with 320 grit, and that's on the top. On the edges, I scraped, went to 120 grit, to 220 to 320 hand sanded, and on the back I scraped, and see if I can give you a good glimpse here, scraped, and before I mess that edge up, I'm gonna stop that. Scraped and did 120, 220, and stop there. It's the bottom, it's really not going to be seen, so it doesn't need to be glass smooth. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and hit it with some of my homemade varnish. That's usually my first step in finishing, and that consists of about 1/3 boiled linseed oil, or in this case I think I used tung oil on this one, 1/3 polyurethane, and that is General Finishes Armor Seal Gloss, and then 1/3 mineral spirits. And actually I think I added a little dash of methyl ethyl ketone, which is some stuff I picked up, which highly evaporative solvent, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's pretty nasty stuff, but from what I understand about solvents, it helps it penetrate deeper, and it flashes off pretty quickly, so it speeds up the drying process. So I'm going to go ahead and set the camera down and start slathering this stuff on. Now I see some guys applying oil finishes, be it boiled linseed oil, be it Danish oil, without gloves, and I don't understand that, man. I always wear gloves. It's got chemicals in it. It's got metallic dryers, I believe is what it's called, for the boiled part of the linseed oil, and it's just not something I would want to get on my skin, so I always wear gloves. The only time I don't wear gloves, and that's only sometimes, is if I'm using shellac, and that's just because it's just alcohol. But I think that stuff is bad alcohol, and so I probably should wear gloves when I use that stuff too. But I don't all the time. Now, a lot of you woodworkers know this is the moment that you all look forward to, man. You get it all sanded up, scraped up, and apply the finish. It's the moment of truth. Oh yeah, look at that! Look at that! Yep, there's methyl ethyl ketone in this. It's pretty bad. You can't see me, but I should be wearing a mask, a respirator. In fact, I am wearing a respirator. I'm wearing a KN95 respirator. Wow, look at that. Look at the Amazonique, I believe it is. Look at it pop, man. That stuff is really cool. I've been sitting on it for probably 5 years. I had gotten it on a deal on one of the veneer websites, and it's not a typical wood, and so I didn't really have a lot of projects that called for anything like this. But now that I see it, man, I think I might get more and try to do something else with it. It's pretty nice stuff. All right, so because this is a chessboard, the surface is going to be looked at and played upon and stared at. I am going to wet sand with some higher grit sandpaper, and now is the time to do that. Once you get a little bit of this stuff on the surface, I might actually do a little bit more because it seems to be soaking in pretty well. And all that's going to do in theory is get some really fine particles. And now this might actually be a bad thing. This we're going to find out. It's going to pull up a bunch of particles. It's sandpaper. It's going to make sanding dust, and the sanding dust, in theory, is supposed to fall down and lodge itself in the pores of the wood, thereby acting as sort of a grain filler. I've used it to good effect. Never on a surface like this where you've got 4 different woods, 4 different colors. So we'll see. And for this, I will be using P600 because that's what I pulled out. I'm not sure how important it is when you're wet sanding to go with the grain on a high grit. 600, I would imagine, is a little more important than if I were to be using like 1000 grit or 1500. So I'm going to go with the grain as much as possible here. And I can tell as I sand, it's starting to dry out, which means I'm making that slurry, that sanding dust oil mixture, and I'm hoping that it is lodging itself in the pores of the wood here. Now, I said it might not be a good idea because, you know, if you think about it, if I'm sanding up all these different colors and all the different colors are lodging into, say, places on the white maple, you know, in theory you would think that would produce a muddled result. But I think what's going to happen here is because maple is a closed pore wood, I don't think I'm going to have a problem. The two woods on here that have open grain are the Amazonique and the Sapelli. So pretty similarly colored. Okay. Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to slop more of that on there. I really want to, because the surface is dry. But I think I'm going to take it slow, and I'm going to build layers. So I'm going to let this dry at least till overnight. As you probably know or do not know, any kind of oil-based finish with boiled linseed oil takes longer than 24 hours to dry, but I'm not interested in it curing completely. I'm just interested in it hardening up enough that I can then put a little bit more on and then wet sand with a higher grit. This is P600, so probably something like a P800 or P1000. And then once I get to that point and I'm happy with the the appearance of the pores and the raking light, I will let it cure completely and then proceed with quite a few layers of polyurethane. That's all for now. Thank you. See you next time.